everyone. Welcome once again to the School of Empirical Studies in Software Engineering. It is a great pleasure for me and Adolfo to welcome Professor Carolyn Seaman from the University of Maryland. She is widely recognized for her contributions to empirical software engineering, particularly in qualitative research. Throughout the school, we have been encouraging students to reflect on the reasoning behind methodological decisions, and I think the title of today's talk captures that spirit beautifully. Research Design, What I Wish I'd Known Then. As this is our final lecture, we are truly happy and honored to conclude this series with someone whose work has inspired so many researchers in the field. Professor Seaman, thank you very much for accepting our invitation and for being here with us today. I'll now hand it over to you. Please feel free to start your presentation.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Lillian, and thank you, Adolfo, for the invitation. And for all of you who are listening, thanks for joining us. Let me go ahead and start. So yes, the title of this lecture is What I Wish I'd Known. You already know who I am. I'm Carolyn Seaman. I'm from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, or more commonly called UMBC, which is in Baltimore in the United States. And this talk is a little bit about my journey. I won't tell you my whole life story, but it's a little bit of my background. I've been a software engineering researcher and a professor for a long time, so I'm going to share with you a bit about what I've learned. And we're going to talk about research design, all of this in the context of research design. So a little bit about me and why maybe I might have something useful to tell you. So I have not been a software engineering researcher for a million years, but I have been doing this since the last millennium, a really long time ago. I am a full professor in an R1 research university, and in the United States, R1 is the highest classification for research excellence and research productivity. So we're in the top tier of research universities in the country. I've published a lot of papers. I've mentored some students. I've gotten some grants. So I've been in this business for a while, and I've been doing research for a long time. So hopefully I've learned something that I can share with you today. So what do I wish that I'd known back when I started as a beginning PhD student? And really, I wish I had understood better what is research, what's the nature of research, what is it really? We call research at the undergraduate level or in school is something very different than what we as doctoral level researchers call it. It's not just reading stuff and writing stuff down. There's a whole bunch of stuff that happens in between. And I didn't really understand that when I started as a PhD student. So let me tell you a little bit of a story. I have two sons, and many years ago, one of them had career day at their school. So career day is where they invite some of the parents to come in and talk about what they do for a living. And I was already working as an academic. I'd finished my PhD, and so I was a researcher. So I struggled a little bit with how to explain to a bunch of 5-year-olds what a researcher does. So what I said to them is that I get to learn things that no one has ever learned before. That's the definition of a researcher. Well, that fell completely flat with these 5-year-olds. They had no idea what I was talking about. My son came home after school and told me that he thought I had the most boring job in the whole world. So this didn't fly very well with the 5-year-olds, but this is the basic definition of research. It's the discovery of new knowledge. It's this discovery and the learning of things that nobody has ever learned before, which I find very exciting, even if my son and his 5-year-old classmates were not impressed. So discovery of new knowledge, that's a definition, but it's not very actionable. How do you start? How do you know what new knowledge you want to discover? And how do you know what new knowledge there is to discover? So you need a starting point. And I think for a lot of doctoral students and early researchers, this is really hard. To figure out what exactly you need to do first, what you need to figure out first. So there are a number of different ways to think about a starting point, and a lot of times your mentor will have their favorite way to start out. But I'm going to talk about several of them. So first are research questions, and a lot of experienced researchers really lean hard on research questions and really say that's really where you start. That's the fundamental starting point. That's you've got to nail down your research questions first. There are others who say that no, you really have to start with the problem. What is the problem that you're trying to solve, and be able to state that clearly? And that's absolutely the right starting point. Others say, well, you have to figure out what you're going to evaluate. You have to have something, some object that you're going to learn more about in order to evaluate it in some holistic way. And that's where you have to start. And other researchers will say, well, you have to start with hypotheses. You have to figure out what you think might be true and then go about testing it. Well, I think, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, that it doesn't really matter which of these you choose as the starting point. All of these are good ways to start thinking about the research that you want to do. So one of the lessons I have learned over time is that you don't need to get so hung up about having the right starting point. It really doesn't matter where you start, as long as you're open to ending up somewhere else, as long as you're committed to the journey. And where the journey ends up is far more important than where it starts. Okay, so I will talk about each of these things and how they fit together. But the main message here is it's okay wherever you start. You can start in the most natural place for you. So let's start with research questions, or let's start talking about research questions. So a research question is something that nobody knows, okay, because you're discovering new knowledge. So you want to answer a question that you don't already know the answer to. So things like, how do software engineers decide when to stop testing? Do more experienced developers write better comments? These are things we don't really know, right? But they also need to be questions that you can answer by collecting data and analyzing that data. In other words, you have to take an empirical approach. Now, I can go into, what's the difference between the empirical approach to research as opposed to others. But this is the empirical software engineering school. So I'm going to assume that we're all in the empirical camp and that you want to conduct empirical research. So that starts with when you're formulating your research questions, you have to keep that in mind. You have to come up with questions that can be answered empirically. It also has to be something that people want to know. Okay, there has to be some motivation. Some questions are just not very interesting. Okay, so you want to choose research questions that will discover knowledge that's useful and that people want to know. Now, this is where other things come in. Motivation, what makes your research questions interesting and useful, is usually related to a problem. It's usually related to something that we want to improve or something that we want to change. So research questions are not independent of problem statements. You don't have to have both of them when you start out, but you usually work between those two very early on. Okay, so I'm going to be building this sort of model of how these things fit together. So I'm going to start with research questions and problem statements. So research questions over here on the right, this collection of questions that you might have at the beginning of your research. And research questions, even though they're not always why questions, they don't always start with the word why, but in general, at a philosophical point of view, your research questions help you understand the why behind a topic or a problem, okay? So research questions are about the why. Then on the left, you might have a problem. And whether you start with the problem or you start with the research questions, it doesn't matter because they're related to each other in several ways. So one is that you might ask some research questions and answer them in order to find out if the problem that you're thinking of is really a problem. Okay, how often is this problem encountered? You might ask practitioners if they think it's a problem. You might ask questions about where it's a problem. What kinds of software engineering contexts is this a problem? So you want to find out if it's a problem and where that problem is. So you might have some research questions that will help you do that. You might have other research questions to help you understand the problem. What impact does this problem have? What are the root causes? What are the related technologies? How did we get to this problem and who does it affect? So you might have research questions that help you as the researcher to understand the problem better, so you're more likely to be able to solve it. And then you actually want to solve the problem, right? And that usually involves answering some questions. So your journey on the way from the problem to the solution has a bunch of questions along the way, and many of those are research questions. So in all these ways, problems and research questions are related. Either can be the starting point of thinking about your topic, but keep in mind that if you start with a problem, you're eventually going to have some questions to answer. And if you have some research questions, they need to be related to a problem in order to be important and motivated research questions. Okay, so let's talk about how it works if your problem statement is really your starting point. That is, there's a problem in mind, and that's what motivates you and what leads you to your research topic. Okay, so we already talked about the relationship between problems and research questions as starting points for research. But then there's the solution. Okay, if you have a problem, obviously you want to have a solution. So this is this other thing in the middle. And the research in part will be that arrow that leads from the problem to the solution. Okay. So solving the problem, okay, let me make this point. Solving the problem and coming up with the solution, not everybody agrees with this, but I'll say it anyway. That's not research, that's engineering. Engineering is problem solving. Engineering is coming up with a solution. But those research questions over on the right that come out of delving into your problem, that's where the research happens. Answering those questions, that's the discovery of new knowledge. Okay, that's one way to make it research. Another is using the solution as the starting point. Now, implicitly, if it's a solution, it has to have had a problem, but you might start with the solution. Maybe you were not the person to develop the solution. Maybe somebody else developed a solution, but you want to know more about it. You have questions about the solution. You might want to evaluate it, figure out how well it works. Does it solve the whole problem? Does it solve the problem in some contexts, but not others? You might want to refine the solution. It's a good solution, but maybe it could be better. So maybe you want to tweak it and see if the ways that you change that solution make it better in some way. Or you might want to adapt it. Perhaps the solution was developed in a particular context for a particular instance of the problem, and you want to adapt it for a different context, a different instance of the problem. So that's another way to make it research. Okay. So let's talk in particular about evaluation, because a lot of research is evaluative research. Okay, it is meant, the purpose of the research is to evaluate a solution or an approach. Okay, so if that's the kind of research you're doing, if the solution is your starting point and you want to evaluate, then you have evaluation questions. Okay, things like, does it work? How well does it work? Under what conditions does it work? Does it work better than something else? Maybe there's another solution that you want to compare it to. Okay, so these are questions you want to ask that will help you evaluate the solution. But guess what? These are actually research questions too. Okay, so all of these evaluation questions can be thought of as a particular type of research questions. So now we've brought in research questions again. So if we put it all together, we have problems, we have research questions. So problems need to be solved, something we want to improve, an impact that we want to have on practice. And the research questions are the new things we want to know that we don't already know. So as we said, problems motivate research questions, and research questions help solve problems. And once you get to a solution and you want to evaluate it, you come up with evaluation questions, which are, again, research questions. So that's putting it all together. And again, it doesn't matter where in this picture you start your journey towards developing your research topic, but all these parts, usually all these parts are part of that journey, from an initial idea to a full research design. Okay, so a few caveats or a few things to watch out for. Sometimes you will see problem statements that are masquerading as research questions. So a red flag for me, and again, not everybody agrees with this, but a red flag for me is a research question that starts out with the words, how do we? How do we do this? How do we do that? And usually, almost all the time, what comes after the phrase, how do we, is really a problem to be solved, not a question to be answered. So it's not really a research question. It's maybe something great to work on, but it's a problem statement. Okay. So, so be careful of that. Not everything you do in your research has to be defined as a research question. Problem statements are important too. Another caveat is solutions masquerading as a problem. For example, a problem statement may say we need to apply some hot new topic like, I don't know, AI, to some random software engineering process or some random software engineering phenomenon. Okay, so a problem statement that says we need to usually is about a solution, not always, but often. So a problem statement that really talks more about a solution than the problem is, of course, not really a problem statement. It's a solution statement. So you need to work backwards to figure out what was the problem or what is the problem that this solution fits. And then you move on from there. Okay, what about hypotheses? I forgot about those. So hypotheses are really structured ways to ask a question. Hypotheses are usually formulated in a way that helps you define your variables, quantitative variables in your quantitative analysis. So hypotheses, if you're going to do quantitative work, hypotheses are a good way to structure your research questions. Not all questions can be formulated as hypotheses. And yeah, questions that cannot be formulated as hypotheses, that doesn't necessarily mean they can't be investigated quantitatively. But just some questions are a little more open-ended. So I really see hypotheses as sort of a type of research questions. Okay, they imply different research methods than general research questions, and they're also a perfectly good place to start in defining your research area. But I think they're a subset, a smaller subset of research questions. Okay, but they do fit into this picture. All right, so what about research goals? So some of you probably have mentors who say you have to have a goal, you have to have a research goal. And that is it is part of this configuration. The research goal, in my opinion, should not be your starting point, but it arises from this picture that we're building of all these different parts. So it's the part of the picture that you're working on. So the whole picture, this whole picture, gives context to your work, but your focus really needs to be very crisply defined. And this doesn't have to happen right at the very start. Okay, so going back to this picture, for example, your focus might be on the research questions. Okay, there may be some research questions that you want to answer, and that's going to be the new knowledge that you discover, and that's going to be your research contribution. Okay, so if that's true, your focus is on answering the research questions, but you still need to know something about the problem that motivates those research questions. If they're evaluation questions, you need to know about the solution. And you might need to know something about the journey from the problem to the solution, even if you're not the researcher who went on that journey. Your focus might also be on the problem. Okay, so you might be really focused on solving that problem, coming up with a solution to that problem. But if it's research, along the way, you still need to have at least implicitly some research questions you want to answer. And they might be evaluation questions. Once you come up with your solution, you may want to evaluate it. And then that's the new knowledge that you're generating. The solution by itself, all by itself, is not new knowledge unless you do some research to learn about it. Okay, so that could be your focus, is solving the problem and learning something about that solution. It might be on the journey from the problem to the solution. You may have an interesting approach, an interesting problem-solving approach, or you may be investigating a problem-solving approach in industry, okay? And observing that process, observing that journey from problem to solution may be your research topic. And that's cool too. And then there's evaluation. You could have an evaluative piece of research that looks at an existing solution and an existing problem, and you do research that determines that learns something about how that solution works and where it doesn't work. And then that might even evolve into having some really meaty evaluation questions that are more like generic research questions where you generate new knowledge, maybe independent of the solution that you're evaluating. Okay, so all these sort of brownish blobs here are different research goals. Okay, a research goal is your focus, your part of the picture that you're going to focus on. Okay, so that's how I define a research goal. Okay, so again, it doesn't matter where you start as long as you're open to ending up somewhere else, and as long as you understand all the parts of this picture. Okay, you can pick your brown blob where you live, but you still need to understand the other parts. You need to understand what research questions are relevant, the problems, the solutions, evaluations, and not always hypotheses, but often hypotheses too, even if they're outside your research goal. Okay. So let's back up a little and talk about finding a topic. So maybe even before you get to research questions or problems or whatever, how do you decide where you're going to look? Okay, how do you narrow down the whole space of software engineering research to figure out what you're going to work on? So you have to think about some things. You have to know yourself. What's your background? What are your interests? Don't pick something to work on that you're not really interested in and you don't really care about, right? So know yourself and know the discipline. And this is related to reading the literature and going to conferences and talking to other researchers. Know what people are working on. And in the literature, finding the gaps, finding the pieces, the questions, the problems, etc., that people have not solved already. Because remember, it's new stuff, new knowledge that you want to discover. So find those gaps, and you can't find them unless you really know the literature. So you can't really avoid reading lots and lots of papers. And then back to yourself, you have to assess your own ability to succeed at different things. Okay, you need to choose something. If you are a new doctoral student and you're thinking about what your research topic is going to be for your dissertation, this is something that you're going to be working on for 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 years. Okay, what are you good at? You know, what is going to keep your interest for that long? So you're a big part of the equation, you as the researcher. So you need to think about that when you're trying to find a topic. Certainly bounce it off other people. You can't do this all inside your own head. So get other people to look at your starting point, whether that's a set of research questions or a problem or an evaluation plan or whatever. Get other people to look at it. Now, a lot of researchers get hung up on the whole novelty issue. Yes, you do have to discover knowledge that nobody else knows, but it doesn't have to break new ground completely. You don't have to discover the next evolution of AI, you know, whatever comes after agentic or neurosymbolic or whatever kind of AI there will be next year. You don't have to find the next big thing, okay? I have a phrase that I tell students, especially, not every doctoral dissertation has to break new ground. Because if every doctoral dissertation broke new ground, we wouldn't have any ground to stand on. Not all the ground needs to be broken. So every piece of research makes a contribution to building up the field, and your dissertation has to make that contribution. But more importantly, it has to show that you can do research. That's really the most important function of your dissertation. It doesn't have to change the world. Okay. All right, that's my little sermon on finding a topic. So once you find a topic and you have a starting point, okay, one of those things we talked about, it doesn't have to be all of them yet, then is the process of design, research design. Now, any design process is really a series of making decisions, right? Design decisions. That's true whether you're designing software, whether you're designing systems, whether you're designing workflows. Same with research. And there are a bunch of different choices that you have to make when designing a research study or research agenda. And I'm going to be talking about these in turn. I won't go over them now, but I'm going to start with the research purpose. So there are probably a couple different taxonomies of research purposes. This is a simple one that I like to use. So there's basic research. And to be honest, in software engineering, most research is not basic research, but there is room for that. So basic research is where you're investigating questions that get at fundamental knowledge. So knowledge that is not directly applicable to any particular process in practice, okay? But it's stuff we need to know in order to build on to create solutions for practice, for software engineering practice. And then applied research is where you build on those basic research results and you understand how those results and how those solutions interact with the real world in order to build solutions that are directly usable by practitioners. Then evaluative research, we talked a little bit about that, or evaluation research, where you take a solution that's already there and you assess its effectiveness, its efficiency, its fitness, etc. And evaluative research sort of falls into two parts. Summative evaluation is judging whether it's good or not, whether the solution is good or not, whether it works or not. And formative is evaluative research to improve that solution, to learn about how it works so that you can improve it. Okay. Often those two are a little hard to separate, and often you do both types of evaluation in a single evaluation research study. And there's action research, which is sometimes lumped under applied research because action research is very, 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 very applied. It's where you work with practitioners in a particular context to solve a very specific instance of a problem. But as a researcher, you're also extracting the new knowledge that is gained from solving that instance of the problem. So often the boundaries are not so distinct between these types, and sometimes in a project as big as a dissertation research project, you might touch on different parts of it may fall into different categories. But knowing where your work falls in this helps make a lot of other decisions. So it's important to sort of identify yourself in this taxonomy early on. All right, the other thing you need to think about early on is the role of theory. Okay, so theory, what I mean by theory are just things that have some evidence behind them. Okay, some things that we think are true. Well, let me back up for a minute and put on my empirical hat. In empirical research, hopefully you already know this, empirical research, we never prove anything. If you're going to be an empirical researcher, you should remove the word prove from your vocabulary. Empirical research cannot prove something. It can only accumulate evidence that supports or does not support some proposition. So a theory is a proposition, something we think is true. If it's a grounded theory, that means it has some evidence behind it. Okay, there is a weight of evidence that makes us confident in our belief that that theory is true, that statement is true. So that's what I mean by theory. Based on your starting point, you need some theory or small set of theories that are going to be the basis of your work. And you can find those theories in the literature. Other people may have done studies that developed evidence for the truthfulness of a particular theory. So you can use that as part of your starting point for your research. Or you can develop a theory based on the literature. So it may be that no researcher ahead of you has sort of done the synthesis of a body of work, but you can do that. You can synthesize it and develop a theory that is supported by a set of literature, a body of research. So the point is, you have this theory. It could be stated as a model. It could be stated as a proposition of something that's true or thought to be true. It could be a visualization. It could be a taxonomy or an ontology. But it's something that helps you organize your work. And then what you do with that theory usually falls into two different choices. And there are other ways to use theory in your work. But what you can do is use it as a beginning, as a way to structure your research, a way to frame your research, as a way to identify initial codes or variables or critical issues or finer grained focus of what you're going to do in your research. So you use it as an organizing principle to help you organize and decide what data you're going to collect and how you're going to analyze it. Okay. Or you could use that theory that you have, this grounded theory that you got from the literature in some way, as an end by using it as a hypothesis, and you structure your data to be able to test that hypothesis defined by the theory. Okay, so the theory might generate the hypotheses for you to test, and then you have a hypothesis testing kind of study, or you use it in the beginning to help structure what data you're going to, the data and variables that you're going to collect. Okay, so the important thing is that you decide ahead of time how you're going to use theory. Okay, are you going to generate theory? Are you going to test theory? Or are you going to use theory to structure your research? Okay. Another thing to think about, and this is related to the theory question, is how your research area is evolving and where it is in its stage of evolution. So are you doing work in a brand new area that doesn't have much prior research? Or are you working in an area that has lots of literature out there, but still has some open questions, or somewhere in between? Okay. When I work with PhD students, a lot of times they really, really want to work in that first category of areas. They want to do something brand new. Sometimes I suspect it's because they don't want to read a lot of prior literature, but that's not a good reason to do that. Remember what I said before about doing groundbreaking research. Not everybody needs to do groundbreaking research, and it's really hard to do in your dissertation. So in some ways, the safer path is the second one, where there are a lot of people have come before you working in this area. You have a lot of literature to rely on. You have a lot of examples of studies in that area, and you have some open questions that other researchers have already identified. Okay, so I tend to push my students towards that second category, but it's a spectrum. It doesn't, there's lots of gray area in between, but it's something to think about. Okay, again, as you're developing your research topic, think about what is the history of the area that you're working in, and what already exists and what doesn't. In general, those newer areas of research do require more open, exploratory, more qualitative research designs, and studies in areas that are more developed require less of that, more formal, more quantitative designs with well-defined variables. That's not 100% true, because they're exceptions. So you can apply a theory from another area. You may be working in a very new area, but the theory that you're applying from another area is well developed and has a lot of literature behind it. And you may be able to do that quantitatively in a very formal way, even though the area you're applying it to is quite new and open. Sometimes you're in a well-defined research area, but you're working on developing new variables, which is a very new thing, so that you might use some very open, very qualitative methods for developing support for your new variables. And sometimes in a really wide open, brand new area, there's some small questions where the variables and the metrics are not all that open. They're pretty obvious, and you can manage them quantitatively in a very formal way. So these are some of the exceptions, but my point is that it may be very tempting to delve into a very new area of research and do very open exploratory research designs. But the studies that are in more developed research areas that have well-defined variables, that have certain a history of work in that gives you lots of examples, is in some ways a less risky approach. All right, so let's go to defining variables. At some point in your research design, you have to figure out exactly what it is. You're going to have to define the data that you collect. So if you're doing a completely qualitative study, don't have any quantitative element at all, then you don't have to define variables, but you do have to define something called sensitizing concepts, which sort of substitutes for variables in a qualitative approach. It basically defines what you're going to focus on. Okay. But whether you're defining sort of a sensitizing concept or whether you're defining actual quantitative variables, you have to balance the data that you have available with construct validity, meaning you want to define variables and metrics that actually reflect the phenomenon that you're interested in. But not everything is easily quantifiable. And sometimes what you want to quantify, you don't have the data available to do it exactly the way you want. And that can be really frustrating. But sometimes you have to be creative. Well, okay, I don't have this exact data available to me to measure this one construct exactly the way I want to. But these three other variables, if I take them together and analyze them together and look at a combination of these variables, I can get at what I want. Okay, so sometimes defining variables sounds like the least interesting part of the research design process, but actually it can be very creative. All right, so data collection, I could do hours and hours of lecture on data collection, which I'm not going to do, but there are lots of choices for how you collect data. These are just some of them. Those are probably the more commonly used ones. And these skew towards the qualitative because I'm primarily a qualitative researcher. But there are lots of pros and cons and trade-offs among these. So I won't go deep into that. But of course, part of research design is making all those choices about how you're going to collect the data. And when you're designing your data collection procedures, you have to be very, very complete in your descriptions and your plans. And I use the 5 W's and the H: what, who, when, where, why, and how. So very, very precise definitions of your data items. All the who's. Who is actually going to collect all the data? Are you, or is somebody going to help you? And who are you going to get it from? And be very, very specific in your plan. And then the timing. When are you going to do this? For how long? And what are the periods of time that you're going to collect data about? Where is this data? And access. I'm going to talk about actually, no, I'm not. But access is a big issue. A lot of data is not very accessible, and you really have to balance the data that you want to get versus the data that you can get, because the data that you can get is the only data that you have. And then why? Why do you make all these decisions? Why are you making all these choices? They all have to be justified. And then exactly how it's going to happen. All the very, very detailed data collection procedures. All this has to be documented in your research protocol. All right, data analysis. So again, there are lots and lots of different ways to analyze data. I'm not going to go deep into that. But this is the most commonly forgotten part of a research plan. I think, and I'm guilty of this too. I've done this too, where I, specify in minute detail exactly how I'm going to collect all the data I'm going to collect. And then I jump to the results. And this is, something that's common even in published papers, where they sort of skip over the data analysis plan. But here's what happens when you do that. How your data is collected determines what form the data is in and the content of that data, right? And that constrains what questions you can answer, okay? So depending on what kind of data you have, you can only answer certain types of questions. So that means, again, starting over at the right, what questions you want to answer should determine what form the data must be in, which informs how you collect the data. So you really, that bottom set of arrows and boxes there, you really need to follow that line of logic before you start collecting the data, because then you get holes if you don't do that. So, whoops. So you need to be able to describe ahead of time and in a replicable way how you're going to analyze your data in detail, because thinking through it in detail uncovers the holes, the pieces of data that you weren't planning to collect, right? So you want to do that before it's too late, before you've actually started collecting the data, when you still have an opportunity to make changes to your data collection plan, so that you can fill those holes, so that you end up with the data that you need to answer the questions or to solve the problem that you want to, okay? You also need to think through how you're going to store and organize your data. It's super important. If it's a big study, it's going to generate a ton of data, and it's really easy to get unorganized and to assume that you will just remember how you named things and where you put things. So having a plan for storage and organization of data is really, really important. And as I mentioned before, I review a lot of papers, a lot of empirical papers, a lot of qualitative papers, but quantitative as well. And I find this the biggest issue in papers that are submitted for publication in conferences and journals that describe empirical studies, and the methodology section completely is missing anything about data analysis. So don't make that mistake. And the easiest way to not make that mistake is to plan your data analysis ahead of time as part of research design. All right, a key concept is triangulation. Again, this is something I could talk about forever, but it's really important to understand at least the basic concept. So the triangulation is just defined as gathering and analyzing data of more than one type, or from more than one source, or using more than one technique, more than one data collection technique. Okay. The idea is that you have these different data sets that came about in different ways, so they trade off limitations. Okay. Any data set has some limitations. So you want to triangulate or combine data sets that have different limitations, that when you put them all together and they're all heading in the same way, you increase the validity of your results. So just as an example, say you plan to do an interview study this is not a software engineering example, obviously. You want to interview elementary teachers, and you want to understand how they deal with problematic behaviors in the classroom. So that's great. The interviews will get you really good, rich, good firsthand data. You're talking to the sources, but you're not sure it's completely accurate. You really don't know if the teachers might have reasons to give you information that isn't 100% accurate. You're not sure you'll understand the terminology or the vocabulary that they're using. And you're not sure the teachers are actually aware of all the things they do in the classroom, especially experienced teachers. Some of the things are just, second nature, and they might not think to tell you about them. So to triangulate those interviews, you do some classroom observations, okay, in order to make up for misunderstanding their vocabulary or capturing all the things that they're not aware of doing, because you'll see them doing it. And then it works the other way too. So say you're also planning an observation study in order to learn the same things, the strategies that elementary teachers use when there are problematic behaviors in the classroom. So observation gives you very accurate, you see exactly what's happening, very accurate, very rich data, but it's incredibly expensive, so you can't do a whole lot of it. And so you're not sure you've seen a very broad sample of behavior. There's probably lots of cases, lots of instances, lots of examples that you don't see when you do observation. And you're not sure that what you see as a problematic behavior when you observe is thought of as a problematic behavior by the teachers. So you do some interviews to triangulate your observation data. So you get the best of both worlds. Okay. So that's triangulation, is just collecting and analyzed data in more than one way. Yes, about access again. So in an ideal world, when you're designing your study, you decide exactly what data you want, and then you find a source for that data. Okay, I'm looking for exactly these variables, these data items, this set of data from these sources, and you go and you get it. In reality, it kind of happens the other way around. You find that you have access to some data, and you figure out what useful things you can get from that data. And often it goes back and forth. And this is one of the reasons that research design is not always a linear process. You can't just go through Carolyn's slides one by one and take care of each part of the research design. There's a lot of iteration, in particular between your choices, your design choices around data collection and negotiating access to the data that you want. So looking for sites and looking for sources of data should happen in parallel with research design, because the two will inform each other. So it's something that sometimes takes new researchers by surprise, that access can be actually quite sticky. All right, another thing to think about during research design is, what's the end result going to look like? What is the output? Is this study that you're designing, is it part of some larger thing like your dissertation? Or is it your whole dissertation? Or is it something that's going to stand alone? Okay. If it's part of something larger, then that's another constraint on the research design. You have to produce something that is usable by the larger whole. Who is the audience? Are they academicians? Are they faculty on your dissertation committee? Are they practitioners, or is there some particular customer you're doing this study for? Who's going to be reviewing this work? Are you submitting it to a journal, to a conference, to your dissertation committee, to your peers, your colleagues in your lab? Who is going to decide if this is decent work? And then long term, what is this going to be used for? Is it archival? Is it going to be published in a journal or as your dissertation? Or is it a piece that you want people to use to inspire future work? Okay, is this something you want to live for a long time, or something that will be a reference for people, or that will be an inspiration in the moment that reflects the current state of research? And this is often related to your research purpose that we talked about at the very beginning. So go back to that purpose, and that helps inform where you're shooting for in terms of your output. Okay. I want to talk just a little bit about validity. You do have to think about when you get down to the methodology, the data collection, data analysis procedures, you have to worry about validity. Again, a topic I could talk about for a really long time. But there are a number of different types of validity, but three I think that are key, especially when you're designing your research. So one is construct validity, and that means that the data that you're collecting really does reflect the central concepts, the phenomena that you're trying to capture. Okay, so that you really so that you can show that you understand and that you're operationalizing or measuring that phenomena in a reasonable way that actually represents the phenomenon that you want to understand. Internal validity is about causal relationships. So if your results are about, well, this phenomenon or this variable impacts this other variable, you really have to think about whether it's causality or correlation. And there are lots of different ways to actually provide evidence of causal relationships as opposed to just correlation. And then external validity is the ability to replicate and generalize your findings. So your data came from a particular context or maybe several contexts, but how do you ensure that your findings are also applicable to other contexts that you don't have data from? So there are some common validity issues that you want to watch out for during research design to make sure that you're doing everything you can to avoid them. A couple with qualitative studies that has to do with construct and internal validity stem from the fact that for qualitative work, a lot of the data analysis relies on the researcher's interpretation. So you guard against that, against the possible bias from the researcher, whether that be yourself or other people, by relying a lot on quotes from your data, using triangulation that we talked about before. Negative evidence is where you actually attempt to find evidence that will negate the propositions that you're making, will negate your findings, okay? Having multiple researchers, multiple pairs of eyes on the work is helpful. And then member checking is where you take your results and you go back to your original informants, the people that you collected your data from, and ask them if your results make sense. And then external validity is, you have to think about it differently in a qualitative study. In general, you can't generalize qualitative results, but you can show evidence of transferability, which is the ability for the results that you're getting to be useful in other contexts, maybe not apply as is to other contexts, because qualitative results tend to be very context dependent, but they can at least be useful in helping understand other contexts. And to do this, you need a lot of context information. You need to be able to describe in a lot of detail where your data came from. So similarly, quantitative studies also have some common validity issues. Construct validity, defining variables is hard. So sometimes you don't have the data you want, but you do the best you can. And sometimes that link between the underlying phenomena that you're trying to understand and the variables, the quantitative data that you're collecting, is a little bit tenuous. So that's a construct validity problem. Also data accuracy, depending on where you're getting your data, especially if it was collected for a different purpose, you could be misinterpreting it. So that's a common problem in quantitative studies. In quantitative studies, often you also may have problems with internal validity if you are having trouble making that link between cause and effect. It's very hard to do. It's usually is a process of eliminating alternative explanations for a relationship between two variables. And that usually means having other types of data to test those alternative explanations. And then external validity is also hard in quantitative studies. Again, lots of context information about where the data came from. So the most important thing to remember is there's no perfect study design. And this is true for any kind of design, really. All study designs, all designs of any type, require choices to be made. And those choices should be deliberate and informed, but not all of them can be perfect. So you have to understand the trade-offs, okay, and be able to defend them and document them. Yeah, no perfect study design. All right, and that is all I have for you today. I guess time for questions.
Okay, Lillian, do you have any questions? First, thank you for your talk, Carolyn. It was great. I see there is no questions in the chat. I have my own questions, and I'm. Do you have a question, Lillian?
You can go ahead, please.
Okay, so my first question is, um, you talked that um, the students should go to conferences and read the literature, and nowadays maybe it's probably different from many years ago when we both started doing research, and there are lots of conference. The costs of attending a conference are very high. The literature, there are many journals, there are even preprints. What advice do you have for the students that are here to navigate this world with so much information?
Yeah. Yes, it is information overload. A mentor is an important resource in guiding a student towards the right types of literature. I also think, I didn't talk a lot about the role of AI in research, but of course that's a huge discussion topic. At ICSE, we talked about it almost nonstop, is the role of AI in research. But I think this is a place where AI could be very helpful. Asking AI as an assistant to help guide you towards the most relevant pieces of literature. I've never tried that myself, actually, but I know that some of my students have, and they seem to find it useful. So that's something to look at. That's an emerging area. But I think that could be very helpful, especially as, the literature is huge. It is vast. So I would start with a mentor. I would start with other people in the lab, other more senior researchers or students to find out what they read. And there's always the snowballing technique. You find a paper that you find super, super relevant. It's like, oh, this is the one paper, I'm done. This is all I have to read. Go back and read the references or some of the references from that paper, and you'll find more relevant stuff. It is, I mean, you've never read enough. There's always more to read. And I guess the literature is not technically infinite, but it sometimes feels that way. So, having asking your advisor or your mentor for a few places to start, and then go from there.
Yes, we have a question in the chat, but before I'd like to ask another question, which is related to you have published a highly influential paper, qualitative methods in empirical studies of software engineering in IEEE transactions on software engineering. And if you go to the webpage on Google, there are more than 2,000 reference. So that's a huge accomplishment. But my question is, how did the idea for that paper arrive to you?
Yeah, that's a story. So I was So it was published, I think, in 1998 or 1999. I finished my PhD in 1996. But before that, several years before that, I was trying to put together my research topic. I was struggling, like all PhD students, to figure out what I wanted to do. And I knew that what I wanted to study was how technical people, or how software developers in a team, how they communicate with each other. What are the patterns? What are the problems? And how that related to sort of organizational relationships. And so, my advisor was Victor Basili, who was a big person in the early days of empirical research in software engineering. So obviously I was going to do an empirical dissertation. And at the time, he was very quantitative too. He was big into quantitative variables and quantitative analysis. But I was really, really struggling with how to measure the kinds of things I was interested in. I was really, really struggling to come up with quantitative measures that were meaningful. I could measure all kinds of things, but I couldn't find something that really matched what I was interested in. So Vic had gone, he was an external examiner for a PhD student in some other university, I forget where, in a business school, wasn't in a computer science department. And he came back from that experience and said, hey, this student, they were using something called qualitative methods, which I've never heard of before, but it might be something that you should look at. So I did. I started reading about it. I didn't find anything about qualitative methods in computer science or software engineering. It wasn't really being used at all. So I had to read all this other stuff from sociology and education that was really hard to get through. But I basically taught myself the basics enough to do my dissertation. So my dissertation was largely qualitative. And after I defended my dissertation, one of my dissertation committee members said, this is really the first big piece of work in software engineering that uses qualitative methods. You really should write about that experience, because there's nothing out there for software engineering researchers to depend on if they want to do that. And I'd like to see more qualitative work in our area. So I did. So I wrote the paper, I submitted it. It was, I believe it was a special issue of TSC on, I guess, empirical methods or something like that. So it seemed like a good fit, and the rest is history, I guess. But it came out of my dissertation work and the encouragement of somebody on my committee that this was an important thing to write about.
Great. And then in 2025, you wrote a paper with Hashina Hoda and Robert Felt, Qualitative Research Methods in Software Engineering, Past, Present, and Future. So probably lots of things and lots of papers related to qualitative methods were published between 1999 and 2025, right?
Right. Yes, by me and lots of other people too. Yeah. So the retrospective paper, the past, present, and future paper. So, TSE in 2025, I guess, was celebrating their 50th anniversary of publication. They'd been publishing for 50 years. So what they decided to do was take every 10 years, their first 10 years, their second 10 years, third 10 years, and choose, a few most influential papers of that 10 years. So in the first 10 years, one of the papers of my dissertation mentor, Vic Basili, was chosen, was the first paper about empirical methods. So he asked a number of people, a number of his former students, and myself included, to help him write that retrospective paper. So while I was helping him with that one, I got the email that said that the qualitative methods paper had been chosen for the third decade as one of the most influential papers, and I was supposed to write a retrospective. And I was kind of tired of retrospectives after helping Vic write his. So I decided I needed some help. So I wrote to some friends who were qualitative researchers, because by that point, there are lots of qualitative researchers in software engineering, many who are doing a lot more work than I am. So Rashina and Robert agreed to help me with it. And so we decided to interview each other, as qualitative researchers do. So we interviewed each other. We came up with a set of questions and we recorded the interview. And I have to say our analysis was not as rigorous or as formal as any of us would normally do in a real study, but it came up, it made for an interesting paper. So that's where that paper came from.
Great. Now we have first a comment by Heleno Campos. Thanks for the talk. By the way, very important topic because he first asked a question, which is how do you usually deal with reviewers that do not agree with your research design?
Yeah. Usually I'm very disappointed because if they disagree with the research design, that you can't usually fix it. How do I deal with reviewers? So if it is a problem with the research design, there really isn't anything you can say. I mean, you might try to argue that your design is valid. It depends on what the other reviewers, I guess, say. If you have several reviewers that have a problem with your research design, then there's probably really a problem with your research design, and you have to chalk it up to experience, and you have to go back and depending on what the problem is, redo a lot of your study, which is always really disappointing. But if it's one and you really don't agree, I guess I would make an effort to argue it. If it's a journal, if it's a conference, there's really nothing you can do, right? But if it's a journal, you do have an opportunity to write a rejoinder, unless it was outright rejected. You bring in your methodology books, you cite your Robert Yin and your Strauss and Corbin, or in your, whatever methodology sources you're using. If there were other previous papers that used a similar research design that have been published, you use those as evidence. You build up evidence for your point, and you make a try. And you don't do it alone. One way to avoid this problem is to have lots of people critique your research design ahead of time. And that's true of every stage of research. I always, when I teach qualitative methods, and I teach coding in particular, I say, coding is like swimming. You should never go swimming by yourself. It's dangerous. And that's true for coding, but it's really true for every part of the research process. Research is collaborative. It's best done collaboratively. So the more eyes you have on your research design ahead of time, the less likely you'll run into this problem with reviewers. But when you get a review like this, of course, it's too late for that. So if it's a journal, and if you really disagree with what the reviewer said, and the other reviewers also seem to be in disagreement with that reviewer, it's worth writing up a rejoinder and try to make your case. Otherwise, you chalk it up to learning.
Okay, next question is by Mirko Perkuzik. In the context of industry-academia collaboration, what are your practical criteria for designing a study to be rigorous enough for academia while being feasible and relevant for the industry partner?
Yeah, this is hard. This is very hard. And I'm not sure I've ever done this completely successfully, to be honest. It's something I struggle with a lot. I've come closest to being successful when I have the ability almost to have two research designs that I present sort of the industry version of the research design to industry, and I can tailor that as much as I want. But I have an opportunity to have sort of an academic version of the research design that maybe collects different data, collects additional data, or collects and analyzes, has extra analysis procedures, that does more, basically, that adds to that sort of industry focused one that's more relevant, but it adds some extra stuff that will make it publishable, basically. And maybe I don't need to share all that gory academic detail with my industry partners, as long as I make sure it, and sometimes it works out that the industry study is part of something larger. and what I'm doing for my industry partner specifically won't be publishable, but it contributes to a larger body of work that then will be. So you kind of, you have to sort of split yourself and do the industry facing study design and then the academic study design. And the hard part, of course, is marrying them in the middle and making sure that they feed each other. But that's how I look at it. You often, if you only do what your industry partner is interested in, it might not be publishable. So usually you have to do something extra if you want it to be published in your academic venues.
Okay, Lillian, would you like to ask your question or do you want me to read it?
Yes, I can ask it. Let me see here again. Okay. So, Professor Seaman, in software engineering, we often face the expectation that research should mainly involve quantitative data and experiments.
Mm-hmm.
Even today,
Mm-hmm.
you are someone whose work has shown the value and impact of qualitative research very clearly. What advice would you give to researchers who sometimes feel the need to justify the use of qualitative methods in our field?
Mm. Yeah. So a couple things come to mind. One is back to industry partners. Industry partners tend not to have any problem with qualitative research. Just a little bit of history back when empirical research was kind of looked on with some suspicion in software engineering. This whole idea of collecting and analyzing data in order to learn stuff was at one time a new idea, a radical idea. And the way it got traction, the way it got accepted was really from industry. The fledgling software industry in the 1970s and 1980s wanted to understand how to measure what they were doing so they could get better. And so once industry thought that empirical research was the best thing since sliced bread, then funding agencies got on board. And then that got us respect as empirical researchers. So I don't know, maybe sort of a mini version of that might be happening with qualitative research, because I do see in the literature, some of the most impactful, the most well-done qualitative research has been done in very close collaboration with industry. A lot of the work out of Northern Europe, out of Scandinavia in particular. I'm thinking of work by people like Peggy Story in the University of Victoria. I'm not being exhaustive, but those are the pieces of work that come to mind, as well as Rashina Hoda in Australia. Getting industry folks to buy into qualitative work is not too hard. So it depends on who you need to justify it to. In a publication, maybe. I feel like if you submit something heavily qualitative to a publication venue and the reviewers push back about justifying your methods, then maybe it's not the right place to publish it. Or maybe you do need to beef up your justification. All of us, all researchers, have to justify our methods. And so sometimes if you get pushback on your research methods, it really does mean that you need to do a better job of explaining why you made the choices that you did. So it's not always just that the reviewer's an old fuddy-duddy and a quantitative person. Sometimes, you need to do a better job. So yeah, those are the things. Those are my pieces of advice off the top of my head. Thanks.
Thank you.
And now the last question by Leo Nathan Pascual. From your perspective as an editor and reviewer for top-tier software engineering journals, have you noticed a noticeable shift toward more qualitative research over the years? If so, what do you think is behind these trends?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, definitely. So, when I published my dissertation research, there wasn't any other qualitative research being published. So from an N of 1 in 1998 or 1999 to now. I don't know what the N is now, but I see qualitative work all over the place. Why? Because it's good work. It's you know, some good tools in our tool bag, or toolbox, whatever, or toolkit. That's the word I want. You know, they're really good tools, and they combined well with quantitative work. You know, mixed method. I haven't talked really much about mixed methods, but mixed methods are very powerful. And it's not, you know, it's not too complicated to mix quantitative and qualitative. So you don't have to be a qualitative purist. And there are lots of good opportunities for collaboration. So it's, and a lot of people really enjoy qualitative work. I think it's brought more people into the field who would otherwise be really turned off by very formal quantitative type of work. It allows us to, I think actually the big thing, probably the most important reason that we've seen more qualitative work is it goes along with the trend towards studying people more, paying more attention to the people part of software engineering. You know, it seems obvious now that in order to understand how software is developed, you need to understand the people who develop it. But that was kind of a new concept not too long ago, a couple decades ago. But that has blown up. You know, people are studying people in the software engineering equation, and you can't really do that without qualitative methods. So I think that's a big factor.
Exactly. I believe that's probably one of the most important reasons. So I think Lillian lost connection,
Yeah.
but
Okay.
I can end the transmission, the live stream. Thank you very much, Professor Carolyn. It was a pleasure being with you this afternoon here in Brazil. I believe it's also afternoon here in
Muito obrigada. It was my pleasure.
Okay. And for everyone that we have had several talks before and after ICSI. This is the last one for everyone that watches the talks. If you didn't watch some of the talks, they are recorded. So thank you very much for the viewers. Thanks again, Carolyn. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.